Chapter 4, The Grain Elevator, Food on the Ground, page 52. One wet spring afternoon, I visited the grain elevator in Farmanville, Iowa. That's where George Naylor hauls his corn each October. The sky was a soft gray and it was drizzling lightly. My car rumbled across the railroad tracks. Grain elevators are tall, hollow concrete tubes, like silos. They are the tallest buildings by far in this part of Iowa. You can see them for miles, but what stood out on this gray day was a bright yellow pyramid the size of a circus tent pitched near the base of the elevator. It was an immense pile of corn, left out in the rain. The year before, farmers in the Midwest had had a bumper corn crop. It was too much for the elevators to handle, so some was just dumped on the ground. Even now, 7 months later, there was still a huge pile. As I walked around it, I saw golden kernels everywhere, ground into the mud by tires and boots. Most of this grain is headed for factory farms and processing plants, so no one worries much about keeping it clean. Even so, it was hard not to feel that something was deeply wrong at the sight of so much food left out in the rain. The next afternoon, I met a Mexican-American crop scientist named Ricardo Salvador, a professor at Iowa State University. He told me he'd had a similar reaction the first time he'd seen kernels littering Iowa's roads in October. Farmers haul their corn to town in big open wagons that scatter a light rain of corn behind them. Salvador said the sight of so much corn on the ground made him feel sick. In Mexico, for thousands of years, corn was honored as a source of life. Even today, he said, you do not let corn lie on the ground. To do so would be considered almost sinful. Salvador's reaction, like mine, came about because we were looking at corn the old-fashioned way, as a food. But the businesses that run the grain elevators in the industrial food chain do not look at corn as food. They look at it as a commodity, something to be bought and sold. The corn at the grain elevator was not the same kind of corn you or I eat when we have corn on the cob. What George Naylor grows and what was in the pile by the elevator is a type called No. 2 field corn. These kernels are hard to eat, but if you soak them in water for several hours, you'll finally taste like lightly corn-flavored starch. It is not a food for human beings. It is the raw material out of which the industrial food chain makes beef or chicken or high-fructose corn syrup or maltodextrin. Corn, the commodity. Page 54. Before the railroads crossed America, corn was brought and sold in burlap sacks. More often than not, the sacks bore the name of the farm where the corn had been grown. You could follow a sack from a farm in Iowa to the mill in Manhattan, where it was ground into meal, or to the dairy in Brooklyn, where it was fed to a cow. This made a big difference. Consumers knew who was growing their food. They knew exactly what it was and where it came from. With the coming of the railroads and the grain elevator, the sacks suddenly became a problem. It is a lot easier to break the corn down into kernels and pump it like a liquid into the grain elevators and into the railroad cars. The sacks and the names of the farms had to go. Corn from hundreds of different farms was now mixed all together in a great golden river. The river of corn would flow from the farms to buyers anywhere in the world. Since the buyer couldn't know whose corn they were purchasing, the Chicago Board of Trade made up a category called No. 2 field corn. Any batch of No. 2 corn was guaranteed to be as good as any other No. 2 field corn. The River of Corn, page 55. At the height of the harvest, the grain elevator in Farmanville runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. When George Naylor delivers his truckload of corn, it is weighed and graded, and his account is credited with the day's price per bushel. At that point, it is no longer George Naylor's corn. It becomes part of the vast river of corn flowing out of the Midwest towards your supermarket. I watched a pile of corn pour into a railroad hopper car painted with Cargill's blue and yellow logo. That car was joined to a train more than a mile long, holding 440,000 bushels of corn. Yet that number is a tiny fraction of all the corn produced in the United States. America's farmers produce 13 billion bushels of corn a year. That's up from 4 billion bushels in 1970. The supply of corn is usually far greater than the demand for corn, so new uses must be found for it all the time. People have to consume it in new ways, in new kinds of processed food. Animals that never ate corn before must be taught to eat it. We have to turn it into ethanol fuel for our cars. We have to get other nations to import it. My plan when I came to Iowa was to somehow follow George Naylor's corn on its path to our plates and into our bodies. I should have known that tracing a single bushel of industrial corn is as impossible as tracing a bucket of water after it's been poured into a river. Making matters still more difficult, the Golden River of corn is controlled by a tiny number of corporations. It has been estimated that Cargill and ADM together buy somewhere near a third of all the corn grown in America. These two companies guide corn's path every step of the way. They sell the pesticides and fertilizers to the farmers. They operate most of America's grain elevators. They ship most of the corn exported to other countries. They mill the corn into its different parts to be used in processed food. They feed the corn to livestock and then slaughter the corn-fattened animals. Oh yes, don't forget they also help write many of the rules that govern this whole game. Yet, in spite of their size and power, Cargill and ADM are almost invisible. Neither company sells products directly to consumers, so they don't advertise. They work in secret and seldom cooperate with journalists. Both companies refuse to let me follow the corn river as it passed through their elevators, pipes, freighters, feedlots, mills, and laboratories. 90,000 kernels, page 57. Let's imagine a bushel of number 2 field corn. One bushel holds about 90,000 kernels. Those kernels could come from dozens of different farms. Some might be George Naylor's Pioneer Hybrid 34H31. Some might be his neighbor's genetically modified variety called 33P67. Some might be kernels grown with atrazine, an herbicide or weed killer now banned in Europe but widely used in the U.S. Those might be mixed with kernels grown into another herbicide, metalocker. In the industrial food chain, it doesn't really matter. It's all number 2 corn. Where do those 90,000 kernels wind up? Since all number 2 corn is treated as though it's exactly the same, we don't have to follow Naylor's kernels. We just have to follow the main branches of the river of corn as it flows and divides through the industrial food chain. As you see, most of those kernels wind up being fed to animals. Much of that goes to feeding America's 100 million beef cattle. And the place they are fed is the American factory farm. The factory farms take the raw material, corn, and turn it into another product, meat. If you count all the chickens, pigs, and fish, there are hundreds of millions of food animals raised on factory farms every year. These animals once were raised on family farms and ranches. Now they are gathered together in great eating camps, where they consume the mounting pile of surplus corn. One of the strangest parts of the industrial food chain is the way it forces some animals to eat corn. And the saddest example of this might be what it means for cows. The cow is by nature not a corn eater. Getting cows to eat a corn diet takes a heroic effort on the part of the factory farm. But the river of surplus corn is waiting, and so the cows must be forced to consume it and turn it into beef you and I can buy. Enter the corn-fed American steer.